But the thing I love about Lynne the most is that she takes things that are considered out there or in the spiritual realm, and she grounds it in science. And she does research with scientists on how they can explain these phenomenon. So without further ado, so excited to have Lynne on the show.
Lynne McTaggart, it is so wonderful to have you here. I would love to dive in and just hear about, I found your work through the field, and I was blown away by the research that you discovered and that you collected together. I'd love to hear, just for our listeners, a little bit more about what the field is.
Well, I run a magazine called What Doctors Don't Tell You, and I've co-edited this with my husband, Brian Hubbard, for 27 years. And in the middle of my research in the early 90s, I kept coming across very good studies of, this is scientific studies with all the double-blind everything of spiritual healing. And I kept thinking to myself, how does this work that you can have a thought and send it to someone else and have them get better? Because this seems to violate everything we think about how the universe works. So I kept thinking there must be such a thing as energy fields in the body. So I thought, well, I'm going to just investigate this a little bit. I'll talk to some cutting edge scientists. They'll probably know this, and it'll be really simple, and I'll write it up. What I wasn't prepared for was what I did discover when I spoke to these scientists, which is that each of them were uncovering essentially the makings of a new science. And this science did not resemble the science we've been told in any way. This science was talking about a giant quantum energy field. I call the field, they call it the 0 point field, which unites everybody essentially at our subatomic level, like an invisible web. And this isn't just woo-woo. This is the stuff of scientific fact, because they know with subatomic particles, they're not little particles, even though they're called that. They're actually vibrating packets of energy, and they send energy back and forth like an endless game of tennis. That particle exchange of energy, when it's just between two particles, is pretty teensy, half a watt's worth of energy. But when you multiply this by all the subatomic particles of all the things in all of the universe, you have this extraordinary, unfathomable amount of energy just sitting there in empty space, like some sort of supercharged backdrop. Just to give you an idea, the energy density is so much that if you were sitting about a yard away from me, it would be enough to boil all the oceans of the world, the energy in the space between us. So that's how much heaving energy is going on out there in empty space. But there are two big implications here. One is the fact that we're all part of this giant energy web. And it means that we are connected essentially through the furthest reaches of the cosmos. We're connected to everything. And secondly, it gives us a plausible means of trying to explain a lot of things we've never been able to explain, like remote viewing or ESP, or many things, the ESP between loved ones, all that kind of stuff, or twins. All of this can be easily explained with this kind of energy field.
So you're telling me that the work that you've done could explain why Kamlin knows when I've been eating unhealthy and I try to hide it from her. She's really big into organic food, and when she leaves the house for like a day or two, I go out and eat the trashy food that she won't eat, and then she comes home and she's like, I know that you've been eating bad, Louise.
That's ESP, exactly. There.
And I'm really curious. I know that we're going to get into how this affects our relationships, but before we do that, I was blown away by some of the research that you found about ESP and about remote viewing. What is one of your biggest phenomenons that you found that you just have been blown away by the most?
Oh gosh, there's so many of them, but probably the biggest one of all is information and studies demonstrating that we can affect the past. There was an amazing study by an Israeli professor. I wrote about this in my book, The Intention Experiment. And he wanted to debunk alternative medicine. So he set up what he thought was an impossible study. He took a group of patients who had very serious blood infection. It's called blood sepsis. And he divided them in two groups. And one was given just ordinary drugs, and the other were given ordinary drugs, plus they were prayed for. So he was very rigorous about it. And afterward, he studied the medical records of both, and he found that the patients who had been prayed for were better in every regard. They'd left the hospital sooner. They had fewer complications. They just got well faster. So there was a really interesting kicker to this study. The study was carried out in the year 2000, and that included the praying. The patients had been in the hospital in the years 1992 to 1994, 6 to 8 years earlier. So he published this in The Lancet, thinking that this was going to demonstrate once and for all, you can't use the scientific method to analyze alternative medicine. But that wasn't how it was perceived. It was universally acknowledged to be a demonstration that we can go back and change the past. And so that was mind-boggling, but there's also lots of other studies that look like, not that you can go back and fix the past, but that the future is always having an impact on the present moment. So that's probably even more mind-boggling. And I once asked a Princeton University Dean of Engineering, who's been involved in a lot of this study, Robert John, how this could all work. And he just turned to me and said, "Oh, simple, Lynn. Just take time out of it and it all makes sense." And I mean, that to me is probably the statement of all, because that is probably a real demonstration that in the quantum world, in the world of this new science, time is a now and space is a here.
I am blown away constantly whenever I research something more about one of these studies. And one thing that I'd love to hear from you is how the field plays into our relationships. I mean, just thinking about how it affects our past and how it affects our future. When we get into relationships, we start to kind of lose sight of our partner sometimes. And then it kind of can taint our past memories and past experiences that we had when we fell in love with someone. How do you think that plays in?
Well, I think the way it mainly plays in is the idea that our thoughts are not locked inside our heads. We always think of our thoughts as being somehow equivalent to brain activity. I mean, that's what we're told according to conventional science. But what happened in many of these studies that I've written about in my last 3 books, The Field, The Intention Experiment, and The Bond, are all about the fact that our thoughts are trespassers. They are, every thought we have is essentially light. I mean, we know this from the work of the late Fritz Albert Popp, a German physicist. You can't get more serious than German physicists, right? And he discovered that all living things are sending out a tiny current of light. Now, this light has been associated with thoughts of healing and a number of other things. The light seems to go up with when healers, for instance, are sending healing energy. So if thought is light to some degree, light is beaming out all the time. And we know this from many experiments I've done with people, that people are picking up from each other all the time. And we know this from what happens to bonded couples. For instance, there was a really intriguing study called the Love Study, where the Institute of Noetic Sciences wanted to find out what happens when one of a partner, a bonded pair, so a husband and wife team or something like that, when one has cancer and the other one sends him healing intention, him or her. So they got together all of these couples where one of the patients had, one of the couple had cancer. They put the patient with the cancer in one room, hooked him up to all sorts of physiological equipment, measuring everything, and then had a camera trained on him. And then the well partner was put in a completely other part of the building in another room with a monitor so he could see his partner's image flash up from time to time. He was also hooked up to all sorts of physiological equipment, he or she. because they were the well ones were women, some were men. So every time the ill partner's image flashed up, that was the well partner's signal to send loving healing intention to his or her partner. Now, afterward, when they looked at all of the readouts from all of this equipment, they discovered that when the well partner was sending healing intention, his brainwaves and the ill partner's brainwaves started synchronizing. Their heart rates started synchronizing. Their breathing started synchronizing. Every aspect of their bodies became synchronized. It was a little bit like two bodies became one. So our intentions, our thoughts about our partner are having an amazing impact on that partner at every moment.
That's amazing. One of the things that I've done is I've created this little deck for couples. And the idea behind the deck is each partner has a little stand and, their own deck. And then it just has questions or thoughts, like what's one thing that I appreciate about my partner this week? Or what's one quality that my partner gives to our children that I don't? And the idea is it's just sitting there. And so, while you're sitting on your computer, you kind of, periodically look at this question and maybe you think about it, maybe you don't. But what's happening is that these thoughts start to arise of appreciation. And while you're away from your partner, you're creating these good feelings. And then when you get together, it's kind of like, whoa, I know that you've been thinking good things about me. Somehow I feel that people pick up on that stuff. And then, while we're away from each other, we're creating really positive sentiments. For me, that's just really pointing at what you said to how powerful this little deck is and why it's important for couples or friends or, we just want to focus on really loving thoughts. Just as you were talking, I was sending out love to people in my life. And I just felt this sense of I just felt so good, just to start feeling loving thoughts towards people in my life.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing too. Of course, it is a virtuous circle. There's a lot of information I've got in the bond that talks about how we've been designed to feel as good about giving to others as eating or having sex. So nature has designed us to feel good about giving. And when that has to do with a partner, it is, there's a whole big whoosh of all of those chemicals, oxytocin and the vagus nerve activation, all of those things involved in compassion, altruism, love are all activated. So, our thoughts are a powerful, powerful mechanism that we feel globally in our bodies, and also we transmit globally to other people. And the reverse of that is true too. There was one very interesting study showing that with just one argument between a couple, if one of the partners got a wound, it takes a whole day longer for that wound to heal after one argument.
Like a physical wound. Wow.
Yeah, and according to the research of Dr. John and Julie Gottman, the work that I taught for years is, for every 7 put downs or kind of negative things said, the partner who hears this has been shown to get sick one time a year. So it's really amazing to hear how this research is showing this kind of stuff that just seems like common sense, but it just, once we put it in research terms, it makes people go, well, now it must be real. It must be true. My biggest question for you right now is, okay, so thoughts are so powerful and the things that we say are so impactful and the things that we're thinking can really negatively and deleteriously or positively impact our partner. That just makes me become this constant scanner of my thoughts and go, no, bad boy, just constantly scanning my thoughts, which sounds like chaos as well. What do you say about that? Or how do we, kind of create a friendship or alliance with our thoughts? Because I know that my mind can run wild sometimes.
Well, one of the things that I teach in a lot of my workshops is how to start monitoring what you're sending, so that you're not doing such an unconscious broadcast, because that's what's happening all the time. People are unconsciously broadcasting. We're just, beaming out negative stuff. If you were to start journaling what you're thinking, you would see that most people, it's probably about 70% negative. We're making judgments, we're making about ourselves and everybody else. We're undermining our own performance by, worrying unnecessarily that we're going to fail or thinking we're going to fail. Every little bit of flotsam and jetsam that's going through our brains, every last beggarly thought, everything of that is also getting beamed out. And that is becoming the broadcast, the intention you're sending to the world.
And you have this whole book on the intention experiment. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how intention affects our relationships?
Or just our life too? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I wanted to do was find out what intention is, for one thing, when I wrote that book, because after the field, there was a lot of, there were some implications in a lot of those studies that I wrote about, suggesting that consciousness is an actual something with the capacity to affect physical matter. So a lot of people have been talking about manifestation and law of attraction and all of that stuff. And I wanted to, the kind of serious, investigative, hard-nosed reporter in me wanted to know, well, okay, what can you do with this really? And also, what happens if lots of people are thinking the same thought at the same time? Does it magnify the effect? So I wanted to investigate a lot of the science of intention, which I did, but I also wanted to go further and see about collective thought and what happens there. And so the intention experiment is not just a book, it's also an ongoing experiment. Since 2007, I've been running these giant global experiments where we invite our readers to come on my website and send intention to some target that's been set up very, very painstakingly in a laboratory in some university. So I've been working a lot with the University of Arizona, but other universities too, where we've set up some sort of, as I say, carefully monitored, blinded study. I mean, we've sent intention to make seeds grow faster under very scientific conditions. And every time we've done this, we ran it 12 times. The seed sent intention grew higher than all the controls. And we've changed water, we changed water pH. We've even had 4 experiments lowering violence in a war-torn area. And each time we've seen, there have been 27 experiments to date, and 23 of them have shown positive measurable effects. So that's what we wanted to do, to see about group mind. Now, there's a lot of really interesting things that relate to relationships. I mean, first of all, there is the fact that, particularly among bonded couples, your partner is reading you all the time. Your unconscious broadcast is being sent out and replied to on a different level. So we know that. And we also know that, the closer you are with somebody, the more it seems that they are able to pick up a lot of information about you via things like ESP. So the big question here is, how conscious are you? Are you using intention in a positive way? Are you using it to also create your relationship? One of the things that I write about in The Bond so much is the power of changing what you have a relationship for. I mean, most people actually have a dominance view of relationship. I have to be right. And if I'm not right, I have to demonize the other person. In fact, I have to pulverize them, in order for me to be right. That seems to be primary, instead of making the most important aspect about it all, the connection.
That brings me to the question about relating.
Can I say something about that? Because, to me, I just really want to jump on this, especially for the listener, is I know that I grew up with a really hard childhood. And in the earliest years, first 8 years of my life, I was heavily chastised, punished, treated badly when I made mistakes. And it's, in talking to people, I understand that this is just a really common human thing, that we tend to want to punish people for mistakes, or when we're hurt, we tend to lash out and do things that, unconsciously, or some part of us really wants the other person to hurt. And it's taken me a lot of work, and Kamala's been an incredible teacher, but I mean, I've been working on this my whole life, is how not to punish the person when I'm feeling hurt or when they make a mistake, and focusing on, rather have a connection. And Kamala and I have just gotten so much better when we're upset with each other, and saying, hey, I'm upset, but I'm desiring connection with you, and I don't want this upset to take over. And it's just something that's really had an impact. And I know that it's had an impact of, this relationship impacts all other relationships. I just wanted to say that because it's so important for couples to learn how not to punish each other.
I think that's such a good comment. One of the things that's come forth in a lot of the work that I did in the Bond and research I found was the power of being vulnerable when you are in a relationship. Usually, as I say, people think of a relationship and its importance, that dominance is a really important feature of it. And that's because we're taught from the very, earliest times to be so competitive. But there's a lot of evidence about the power of vulnerability. And I take this from the work of a guy called Orland Bishop, who is creating relationships among the impossible. And that is among rival gang members in Watts, California, which is one of the most violent places in America, where they've got these heavy-duty rival gangs. And he's getting these young men who have all come from highly wounded backgrounds to come sit down and talk to each other with the idea of connection, to relate in harmony. It sounds like a fool's errand, but he's managing it. And the way he's doing it is by encouraging them to have deep talk, as he says, where they're vulnerable. They talk about their backstory. Where did they, why are they who they are? Where did they come from? And he encourages them to be highly vulnerable. And with that vulnerability, instead of the other being the dominant force, it encourages the heart to leap across the fence. I mean, it is the most powerful thing. And, more people from opposing situations need to try to do this. There was a wonderful situation like this, not with couples, but with opposing groups, when a Planned Parenthood facility in America got bombed. A guy came in and started shooting all of the staff who was anti-abortion. And when that happened, the right to life people who were against abortion and the right to free choice people who were in favor of abortion decided it was time for them to come together and start talking. So they met in secret for a couple of years, and they learned during that time to be vulnerable, to talk to each other about why they believed what they believed, and also to stop demonizing the other. And so they were learning a very gentler way of relating. And at the end of a few years, they learned how to start working together in lots of ways. They also held a press conference. And of course, the reporters asked them, oh, right, so who won the debate? And they said, well, no one, because now that we've shared why we believe what we believe what we believe more firmly. And so the reporter said, oh, well, then the whole thing's been a mistake and a failure. And they said, oh, no, because now we go out together, we party together, we look after each other's children, we love each other. So even in that kind of situation of big disagreement, being vulnerable, sharing why you believe what you believe, what's your backstory, being vulnerable allows the heart to leap across the fence.
That's so beautiful to hear that. Learning how to be vulnerable and weak and talk from a place of what's happening for us. That's a skill that's incredibly special and it's incredibly challenging. For some reason, I just think of this couple in a class, and the wife is telling a story about how her and her husband just got in this huge fight. She got angry and, they were about to go to bed. And she said, fine, I'm going to go in the other room and sleep in the other room. And so she went and laid down in one of the children's beds. And, she kind of laughed and she said, I was too big for the bed. And I was hoping the whole time that he would come in and get me and that we could, fix things. So while she's acting angry, she's still desiring connection. I've noticed that within myself and within other people. And it's so hard to admit that. I mean, I imagine that these gang members are also, desiring connection. It's just they haven't learned how to have it. So, it's like in this movie, the movie Crash, we all want to touch each other or connect with each other. So we crash into each other because we're just desiring that so much that this is maybe the only tactic that we have.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I'd love to hear a little bit more about relating in a new way, because sometimes in relationships, we can get into these competitive push and pull ways. And I'd love to hear about how we can move out of that competition and into a new way.
Well, I think the really important thing is there are several things. One is the power of apology. Two, the power of, and as I say, the power of vulnerability. These sorts of things are always thought, oh no, these are real signs of weakness. As though our relationship is a competitive situation that we must, we have to get there first on the finishing line in order to have a relationship. So one of the things that I emphasize in the bond that many people have, and I've got a lot of worksheets about this, is learning how to cross cultural divides and cross ideological divides, or just divides, to connect with people who are not like you or people who aren't agreeing with you at the moment. And the big thing is, one, sending them loving intention while you're having this argument. You see what happens. In my workshops, I have people come together and start arguing on a subject they really disagree with. Or one will talk about why he believes what he believes, and the other one sends him loving intention. And it's amazing. All of the heat goes out of the person who's listening by doing that. So that's one really important little tool that works beautifully.
I love how simple it is, but how impactful and profound it can be. One thing I really want to hear about from you is, you talked about consciousness, and being conscious in relationships often requires us to be mindful of our own bodies, mindful of our own feelings, mindful of how the other person is responding. And I'd love to hear.
I almost thought you were going to try to get her to say, Louise, you can't eat unhealthy food.
No, well, I'm not going to corner you live. I would love to hear a little bit more about consciousness and how we can bring more consciousness into our relationships.
Well, I think that being conscious is being present. And there are many ways. There is, with intention. In my book, The Intention Experiment, I have a powering up program, which I devised from listening to a lot of and interviewing a lot of masters of intention, Buddhist monks, Qigong masters, master healers. And they all had different ways of doing intention. But there were also so many commonalities that I sort of distilled all of their commonalities into a simple program people could follow. So it was really how to be very focused with intention, how to be very heart-centered with intention. But one of the things that's really important in focus is just being present. And the easiest way to learn how to do that is some bouts every day of mindfulness meditation. And what that is non-judgmental awareness of the present moment and your present activity, and slowing down just to come into your senses. So, if you're eating your breakfast, granola, let's say, listening to the sound of it, I'm sure you don't ever, feeling what it feels like when it goes down your throat, I'm sure you don't slow down enough, smelling it, and as I say, kind of tasting the crunch of it, really, listening to all of that and just slowing down to kind of absorb that. So we use our eyes a lot more and our ears to a slightly lesser extent, but our other senses too are really operational. And so it's important when we're relating to someone, as I say, or if you're just waiting in line or you're tying your shoe or putting on your coat, just being mindful, just go into your senses for a few minutes. And that can help you learn to be present when someone else is there. Another way of learning to be present is to do, I talk about this a lot in my book, The Bond, just the art of dialogue. If you're with a group of people or just with one other, instead of arguing or discussing something in order to win, you discuss it as though you are bouncing a ball around. So you don't win, you just slow down long enough to listen to where the conversation is going without judgment. And if you try that, that's a neat little trick to stop wanting to dominate and win and be competitive.
This is so powerful, everything that you've shared. And I'm wondering if there's any last closing thoughts you want to make sure the audience walks away with.
Just to be, slow down long enough in your relationship to understand that it's less important to be right and much more important to be mindful, to be present, to be conscious, and to connect.
Do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? Very well said, Lynne. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We've really appreciated. We are completely in love with your work, so it's been an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Thriving Launch podcast. For books and resources related to today's episode, make sure to head over to thrivinglaunch.com. We'll see you there. Tune into the next episode where we're going to talk about being an empowered female entrepreneur.